In early March of this year, a sequence of events unfolded that most energy analysts had modeled only as a worst-case scenario. Iranian forces declared the Strait of Hormuz closed to international shipping, backing the declaration with naval mines, anti-ship missiles, and a willingness to fire on commercial tankers attempting passage. Within 48 hours, roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply became inaccessible. Brent crude, which had been hovering near $70 a barrel just weeks earlier, surged past 80 within days. By the first week of April, it crossed $113 at gas stations across the United States. The national average climbed past $4 a gallon for the first time in years, and in states like California, drivers confronted prices exceeding $6. The disruption was not theoretical, not a projection, not a talking point from a think tank briefing. It was the kind of supply shock that economists describe in textbooks about the 1970s, but rarely expect to witness firsthand. What makes this particular crisis so instructive is not just its magnitude, but its timing. It arrived at a moment when the global transportation system was already in the middle of a slow, contested, and deeply uneven transition away from petroleum. Electric vehicles, which had been the subject of enormous enthusiasm, enormous investment, and enormous backlash over the preceding half-decade, suddenly found themselves repositioned in the public conversation. Not as aspirational technology for the environmentally conscious, not as a cultural signifier, not as a partisan wedge issue, but as something more fundamental, a question of national energy resilience. And the answers that question produces are far more complicated than the cheerful narratives or the cynical dismissals would suggest. To understand why this moment matters, it helps to look backward. The last time the world experienced an oil shock of comparable severity was in 1973, when the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries imposed an embargo against nations that had supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War. The price of crude quadrupled, gas lines stretched for blocks. The American economy, which had built its post-war prosperity on the assumption of cheap, abundant petroleum, was suddenly confronted with the fragility of that assumption. The policy responses that followed shaped the next half-century of energy thinking: the creation of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the introduction of fuel economy standards, investments in nuclear power, and a brief but intense interest in alternative energy that faded almost as soon as oil prices stabilized. The critical lesson of the 1970s, the one that energy historians return to again and again, is that crises produce urgency, but urgency alone does not produce durable change. When the immediate pressure subsides, the systems of convenience and cost that favored petroleum reasserted themselves with remarkable speed. The current disruption carries echoes of that earlier era, but it has landed in a fundamentally different technological and industrial landscape. In 1973, there was no viable alternative to the internal combustion engine for personal transportation. Electric vehicles existed only as curiosities, golf carts, or engineering experiments confined to university laboratories. Today, the global fleet of electric cars numbers in the tens of millions. In China alone, the annual sales volume of new energy vehicles crossed 10 million units in recent years, accounting for roughly 70% of the global total. Companies like BYD have overtaken Tesla in unit volume. KTL, the Chinese battery giant, commands more than 40% of the global EV battery market. The infrastructure for building, selling, and operating electric vehicles is no longer hypothetical. It is industrial. It is scaled, and it is overwhelmingly concentrated in one country. This geographic concentration is one of the central tensions that the oil crisis has exposed rather than resolved. In the weeks following the Strait of Hormuz closure, interest in electric vehicles surged measurably in markets across the Asia-Pacific region, Europe, and Australia. Used EV sales hit record levels in several European countries as the price of petrol crossed €2 per liter. In Norway, where the EV market was already mature, electric vehicles outsold diesel for the first time in history. In Australia, EV sales in February were 95% higher than the same month a year earlier. The pattern was intuitive. When filling a gas tank becomes suddenly and dramatically more expensive, the calculus of vehicle ownership shifts and the appeal of a car that runs on domestically generated electricity becomes tangible in a way that no amount of climate messaging had managed to achieve. But in the United States, the picture was conspicuously different. Even as gas prices climbed past $4 a gallon and continued rising, American EV sales in the first quarter of the year actually declined by 28% compared to the previous quarter, settling at roughly 212,000 units. This counterintuitive result has several explanations, none of them simple. The most immediate is the tariff wall that the United States has erected against Chinese-made electric vehicles. Under the Biden administration, a 100% tariff was imposed on Chinese EV imports, and the subsequent administration maintained and in some cases expanded these trade barriers. The practical effect has been to exclude from the American market precisely the vehicles that would make electric transportation accessible to middle-income buyers. Compact, well-engineered cars priced between $20,000 and $30,000, produced at scale by manufacturers like BYD, Geely, and Changan. The vehicles that American consumers can actually purchase remain, with few exceptions, expensive. The average transaction price for an EV in the United States still hovers well above $40,000, a figure that places electric ownership out of reach for the majority of households that are most affected by rising gasoline costs. There is a painful irony embedded in this situation. The oil crisis has made the economic case for electric vehicles more compelling than at any point in modern history. The math is straightforward. At $4 per gallon, a driver covering 15,000 miles per year in a conventional sedan spends roughly $2,400 on fuel. An equivalent electric vehicle charged at home at the national average electricity rate costs roughly $600 to power over the same distance. The annual savings approach $2,000, enough to materially affect a household budget, enough to shift purchasing decisions if the upfront cost of the vehicle itself were not a barrier. But the upfront cost remains a barrier, and the policy architecture that might have lowered it, subsidies, manufacturing incentives, strategic partnerships with lower-cost producers, has been systematically dismantled or blocked by a combination of trade protectionism, political hostility toward the EV sector, and legitimate national security concerns about supply chain dependence on China. The supply chain question deserves particular scrutiny because it reveals the degree to which the electric vehicle transition, often presented as a story of technological liberation, is in reality a story of shifting dependencies. The internal combustion age made the industrialized world dependent on petroleum extracted from a handful of geopolitically volatile regions, transported through vulnerable choke points like the Strait of Hormuz. The electric age, as currently configured, risks replacing that dependency with another: reliance on lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements that are mined, refined, and assembled into batteries through supply chains that pass overwhelmingly through Chinese-controlled facilities. More than 60% of the world's cobalt originates in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where mining operations range from industrial-scale enterprises to artisanal sites, where safety standards are minimal and child labor persists despite international scrutiny. The lithium that powers the batteries in most EVs is extracted from brine pools in Chile and Argentina or hard rock mines in Australia, then processed in Chinese refineries that handle the majority of the world's lithium chemical conversion. KO to BYD together account for more than 55% of global EV battery production. The idea that electric vehicles represent energy independence is, at present, a half-truth. They represent independence from petroleum, but not from the concentrated industrial capacity of a single nation, and not from the ethical complexities of mineral extraction in some of the world's poorest and most poorly governed territories. This is not an argument against electrification. It is an argument for understanding what electrification actually requires and for recognizing that the transition is not a simple swap of one fuel source for another, but a comprehensive reorganization of industrial systems, trade relationships, infrastructure, and political priorities. Consider the electrical grid itself. In the United States, roughly 43% of electricity is generated from natural gas, about 18% from coal, and around 26% from renewable sources, including solar, wind, and hydroelectric. Nuclear accounts for most of the remainder. When an electric vehicle plugs into the grid in West Virginia, it is effectively running on coal. When it charges in California, it draws from a mix that includes substantial solar and wind capacity, but also natural gas. The carbon footprint of an EV is not zero. It is a function of the grid that feeds it. And the grid itself faces enormous capacity challenges as demand increases not only from electric vehicles, but from data centers, powering artificial intelligence systems, from heat pumps replacing gas furnaces, and from the general electrification of an economy that was designed around combustion. The Energy Information Administration projects that U.S. power consumption will set new records in both this year and next, and 90% of charging station operators surveyed in recent studies report that grid capacity is the primary constraint limiting their expansion. What the current crisis has done, perhaps more effectively than any policy initiative or marketing campaign, is make the question of transportation energy viscerally real for millions of people who had previously regarded it as abstract. The driver staring at a gas pump displaying $4.12 per gallon is not thinking about carbon emissions or climate targets or the Paris Agreement. That driver is thinking about the $350 it will cost to fuel the family car this month and whether that money could be redirected if the car did not require gasoline. This is the emotional core of the moment, and it is the emotional core that every previous oil crisis has activated, a sudden unwelcome awareness that the systems we depend upon are fragile, that the choices made decades ago about how to power a civilization now constrain the choices available to individuals, and that the path towards something different is neither as simple as its advocates claim nor as impossible as its detractors insist. The most consequential development to emerge from this landscape may not be the surge in EV interest itself, which, as a Forbes analysis recently argued, is likely to prove temporary in the same way that the 2008 oil price spike briefly suppressed SUV sales before the market reverted to its established preferences. The more significant development is happening at the level of battery chemistry. In the final weeks of 2025, KTL confirmed that it would begin large-scale commercial deployment of sodium-ion batteries in 2026, with applications spanning passenger vehicles, battery swap infrastructure, and grid-scale energy storage. Sodium-ion technology does not require lithium, cobalt, or nickel. Sodium is one of the most abundant elements on Earth, found in ordinary salt and seawater in mineral deposits on every continent. The energy density of sodium-ion cells is currently lower than that of lithium-ion, which means shorter range and heavier battery packs. But the cost per kilowatt-hour is substantially less, and the supply chain is, at least in principle, diversifiable in a way that lithium supply chains are not. Changan and KTL have announced a mass-production sodium-ion passenger vehicle slated for launch by mid-year. If the technology proves reliable at scale, it could begin to address the most persistent structural objection to the electric vehicle transition, that it merely substitutes one form of resource dependency for another. But technological possibility and market reality are different things, and they operate on different timescales. The sodium-ion vehicle launching in China this year will not help the American family in Ohio whose gasoline budget has doubled since February. The used EV market, while growing, remains small. The charging infrastructure in rural America is sparse. The political environment is hostile to the subsidies and industrial policy that accelerated EV adoption in China and Europe. And the oil crisis itself, while severe, may not persist long enough to permanently alter consumer behavior. History suggests that when fuel prices decline, the urgency fades and the SUV returns to the driveway. The 2008 crisis produced a brief flowering of interest in hybrids and compact cars. Within 2 years, pickup trucks had reclaimed their position as the best-selling vehicles in America. What distinguishes this moment from 2008, though, is the maturity of the alternative. In 2008, the Nissan Leaf did not yet exist. Tesla was a startup that had produced fewer than 100 cars. The global EV battery industry was embryonic. Today, the industry produces hundreds of gigawatt hours of battery capacity annually. The vehicles are real, varied, and in many markets, cost competitive with their gasoline equivalents. The question is no longer whether the technology works. The question is whether the political, economic, and infrastructural systems that surround the technology can be configured to deliver its benefits broadly rather than narrowly, equitably rather than as a luxury good, and in a time frame that reflects the actual urgency of both energy security and climate constraint. The Strait of Hormuz will eventually reopen. The oil will flow again. Prices will moderate, perhaps not to their pre-crisis levels, but enough to ease the immediate pressure. And when they do, the temptation will be to treat this episode as an anomaly, a geopolitical accident, an aberration that does not require structural response. That temptation has prevailed after every oil shock since 1973. Each time the window of public willingness to accept the costs and disruptions of energy transition narrowed and then closed. Each time, the underlying vulnerability remained, accumulating like deferred maintenance on a bridge that everyone drives across, but no one wants to pay to repair.